This talk was delivered at the 2007 UDL IRN Summit. It's called Capture, Don't Compress, Operationalizing UDL Meaningfully. Here in the United States, UDL legislation has really been heating up over the last 10 years. For example, UDL appears in the National Instructional Materials Accessibility Standards of 2006, the Higher Education Opportunity Act of 2008, the Common Core State Standards Initiative of 2010, the National Education Technology Plan, also of 2010, and it appears over 17 times in the Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015. This is to say nothing of the many state and local laws and initiatives around the country. And some would argue that the way that it's framed in the Individual Disabilities Act of 2004 should also be considered in this list. With all of this policy and written into the legislation of the United States law, one would expect that it would be equally balanced with the rigorous empirical research. Since at least the 1980s, with Reagan's A Nation at Risk, there's been an intense push to ensure that there is a sort of balance between the policies that we bring forth and the research to support them. However, some would argue that that's not the case at the moment. Some say, frequently in recent literature, that UDL lacks clear operationalization, without which it may not be researchable at all. Now, if one follows the trail over to the National Center on Universal Design for Learning, a very different story emerges. There we find that the UDL guidelines are based on research from several very different fields and from many different researchers at many different universities and research organizations. That research has been reviewed, compiled, and organized by educators and researchers at the Center for Applied Special Technology. The process spanned a 10-year period and involved several different stages. From this perspective, that sounds pretty well researched. They're suggesting that UDL is based on research. On the other hand, it has been said that it is not researchable. Based on research, not researchable. Based on research, what is one to believe? Well, I think the way to understanding this might be to look at what Elisa Laurie said in 2016, in which she said that UDL is a framework which in practice is believed to be more than the sum of its parts. This is an important insight. What we know for sure is that all 31 of the UDL checkpoints are thoroughly based on research. However, even if that is so, with the 31 checkpoints each couched in research facilitating the 9 guidelines and the 3 principles of the UDL guidelines, does that necessarily mean that UDL has been researched? If we take what Elisa Laurie was saying too seriously, and most of us in the field do, then this implies that while each of those individual checkpoints may have been researched and researched and researched, it doesn't mean that UDL itself has been researched. Let me explore why this is important. Imagine, for example, that a researcher goes into a school in which she is observing 2 teachers teaching. One teacher says, I'm practicing UDL, and specifically today I'm going to be using checkpoint 2.5, checkpoint 4.2, and checkpoint 8.3. These draw from all 3 of the principles, so the teacher is using multiple means of representation, multiple means of action and expression, multiple means of engagement for his students. Another teacher in the building says, I too am using UDL today, and I'm specifically using checkpoint 1.3, 3.4, and 9.2. Effectively, these 2 teachers may both be practicing UDL, but their behaviors and the action of what's happening in the class looks nothing alike. They're using completely different methods. Now, there are many possible combinations of any 3 UDL checkpoints. And when I say many, what I really mean is that if you do a permutation calculation, you will find that there are 4,495 possible combinations of any 3 UDL checkpoints. To this we may ask the question, who said there had to be 3? And do they have to draw from all 3 principles? Or on what basis are they chosen? Do they need to be permanent fixtures in our class, or can they be temporary to meet a specific situation? These are all good questions, and questions that we're continuing to discuss. So I think that both of these positions are true. UDL is based on research, but it's not research based. And while this seems like a paradox, I think both things can be true depending on how we're looking at it. The framework for the UDL guidelines, each one of those checkpoints is well facilitated in the research, but the framework for as a whole is much more difficult to pin down. Does it matter? Whithurt, the Associate Secretary of Education in the early 20th century, argued that when it comes to evidence for educational practices, scientific research is only one type of empirical evidence, where the difference between scientific research and empirical information may be described as the rigor with which the independent variable is controlled and studied. Many people would argue that when we begin implementing UDL, we do have empirical information. We see, for example, students' performance improve, their attitudes and behaviors improve, the quality of the classroom interaction improve. That's all empirical information that suggests that the practice of UDL did enhance the learning environment, even if we can't scientifically isolate the variable. On the other hand, Whithurt also added that another way to understand the evidence supporting an education practice is to look at professional wisdom. This could be individual experience, individual teachers who've been practicing for a while, and they can tell you it has been my experience that this method, this practice, this approach, this way of designing has improved my practice, improved my students' performance, and the consensus. Universal design for learning has been spreading rapidly, and practitioners, researchers, financiers in higher education all the way down to preschool have come to agree that UDL does in fact work, even if we don't have the scientific research to support it. In this way, we might say that we already have the professional wisdom to give evidence to UDL. We also have empirical information to support UDL. What we're missing is the scientific research, without which some people would say it's difficult for us to prove that we have empirical evidence, and therefore would question if we really have enough evidence to support the type of policy implications that UDL entertains today. Well, after 10 years of trying to operationalize UDL and struggling with this to this day, I think we need to have a talk. I think it's worth asking, can UDL be operationalized? I would say yes, but. And what's the but? Well, I think operationalization and the practice of UDL have a conflict of values, where operationalization is about exactness, repeatability, and objectivity. The practice of UDL is couched in flexibility, dynamics, and subjectivity. It's as if you wanted to study butterflies. And my 6-year-old son is very into butterflies right now, and I'm excited that the spring is coming so I can get one of those grow your own caterpillar into a butterfly kits and take them out into some fields where we can study butterflies in motion. I think that if you really want to understand butterflies, you have to watch them in their fluid dynamics, their movements, their subjectivity, their way of life. Now, you could pin a butterfly down to study it that way, and some do. But when you do this, you kill it. Douglas Adams once said, if you take a cat apart to figure out how it works, the first thing that you have is a not working cat. And I wonder if UDL is like this. I wonder if the attempt to pin it down, to operationalize it, would in the process kill the very thing that we're trying to study. Now, I look back to a seminal piece on this issue, which was Edinburgh's 2010 paper, Would You Recognize It If You Saw It? 10 Propositions for UDL in the Next Decade. And he wrote, in it, 7 of his 10 propositions focused on what UDL is not. What if we approached operationalizing UDL not in terms of what it is, but what it isn't? So Edinburgh gives us a place to start. He said, UDL is not parallel to UD architecture. It's not just good teaching or what we've always done. It's not natural or simple. It's not low tech or no tech. It's not assistive technology. And it's not simply about the primary impact or primary target. That is to say, it's not for example, students with special needs and meeting their accommodations directly. It's about meeting the needs of all of our students. Now, these are propositions, and we don't have to agree with these particular 7 necessarily, or all of 7 of them necessarily, but my point at this time is to use them as a way to frame, to operationalize UDL in the negative. So what if we looked at it this way? UDL is learning designed proactively, drawing intentionally from the UDL guidelines to actively reduce or remove barriers for predictably variable students, including those with disabilities. Inside that yellow box, I'm creating what I'm calling the UDL territory. There's a lot of different ways that that particular design framework might be practiced in a given setting, all the way from pre-K to higher education or beyond, in online settings, in-person settings with different types of students, and so on and so forth. And that very flexibility is what keeps it alive. However, the negative now gives us a boundary line in which when we cross over that, we can say with absolute definitiveness, this is no longer UDL. So for example, if one was attempting to reduce barriers for students but was using assistive technology or was using static methods, then we would say that's no longer UDL. Whether that's useful or not, that's another question, but it's not UDL. This gives us a way to allow for the flexibility, but also gives us a way to say clearly what it is not, and therefore make strides towards operationalizing UDL. So can UDL be operationalized? I say yes, but operationalization should be territorial, not precise. It should be postmodern, not modern. I think this has some important implications and benefits. First, I think for research or for practice, teachers who are using UDL must explicate context and their thought process. They must demonstrate these were my goals, these were the barriers, this was how I utilized the Universal Design for Learning guidelines to explicitly address or remove those barriers and enable a flexible learning experience for my students so that everybody could learn. That metacognition is critical for demonstrating that one is in fact practicing UDL. I think it's also necessary to really bring in those objectives, barriers, rationale for the UDL checkpoints in the methods section if one is running a research report on the practice of UDL as an independent variable. There are a couple big benefits that I see from this. First of all, I think we gain a semi-objective measure by which the operationalization of UDL could be established, something we've been striving for over a decade. Second of all, I think the exemplification of the thought process necessary to actualize UDL in a context would be greatly beneficial for other practitioners or other researchers who are trying to grasp what does the planning, what does the thought process that is central to the Universal Design for Learning framework look like. Design is often what happens inside a person's mind, and so making that thinking visible can be very useful. I want to hear from you. If you have the opportunity, please go to bit.ly/captureudl, and there you can contribute feedback to what you think UDL most essentially is and is not. I hope that this is the idea that we're going to wrestle with over the next year or so, and so that we as a field can come together and establish this territorial definition of UDL in a way that reflects the voices of many of us in the field. I would also encourage you to pilot the concept in your research and practice, and let us know what you learn. Thanks so much for listening.